Good evening and welcome. My name is Aya Yusuf, and it is my honor as student body president to welcome you to the second Chuck Hagel Forum in Global Leadership. Secretary Chuck Hagel and Secretary John Kerry, on behalf of the student body, I thank you for your decades of public service and for sharing your time with the Maverick community. We are thrilled and honored to welcome you to the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Our program will begin with remarks from University of Nebraska at Omaha Senior Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Dr. Sacha Kopp. Dr. Kopp has served as UNO's Chief Academic Officer since April 2019, a role in which he provides strategic direction for the university's academic mission and ongoing support for student success and opportunities. Prior to UNO, Kopp served as a postdoctoral fellow and visiting professor of physics at Syracuse University, as a professor of physics at the University of Texas, and most recently as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of New York at Stony Brook. A leader in his field, Dr. Kopp has published more than 200 journal articles on elementary particle physics and science education, with research supported by the U.S. Department of Energy, the Department of Education, and the National Science Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Senior Vice Chancellor Kopp to the stage.
Thank you, Aya, for that introduction, and thank you, students, faculty, staff, and members of the Omaha community for joining us on our UNO campus. I also extend my sincerest thanks to the organizers and supporters who made this event possible. It's a rare occurrence when two former U.S. Cabinet secretaries gather together on the same stage to share their years of experience and wisdom. So I'd also like to again thank Secretary Hagel and Secretary Kerry for making this a historic day here for UNO. The Chuck Hagel Forum in Global Leadership launched in 2019 with a mission to explore critical issues with global leaders in search of solutions to today's challenges. 30 years after the end of the Cold War, when America's position atop the global order seemed unassailable, the coalitions and institutions that the U.S. and its allies built in the wake of World War II have never been more important. Today, international agreements on security, trade, energy, human rights, and other issues are challenged. Secretary Kerry and Hagel, both Vietnam War veterans, will discuss how this new set of challenges affect the daily lives of people in the state of Nebraska, in the United States, and around the world. Secretary Chuck Hagel embodies what it means to be a UNO maverick, someone who exudes entrepreneurialism, resilience, curiosity, relentlessness, along with the gracious generosity and civility of a fellow Nebraskan. A Nebraska native, Secretary Hagel graduated from our University of Nebraska at Omaha in 1971 after serving in the U.S. Army in Vietnam, where he received 2 Purple Hearts for his selfless service, among other honors. He would go on to serve most notably as the Nebraska U.S. Senator for 2 terms, and later as U.S. Secretary of Defense under President Barack Obama. In addition to his ongoing dedication of time and efforts to support UNO and its mission to serve Omaha and the state of Nebraska, he has since entrusted his alma mater with his archives, launched a leadership symposium for Omaha high school students, and drawn a national spotlight to UNO through this forum. I could go on, but I will end by saying that we at UNO remain grateful to Secretary Hagel for embodying the Maverick spirit and sharing it with the world. We're grateful to Secretary Kerry and to Secretary Hagel for being with us to discuss with this audience the global challenges the nation faces today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Secretary Chuck Hagel to the stage.
Yes, Chuck, thank you. Good evening. I'm very pleased to be here tonight because it's Maverick country, and I appreciate everything that this university does for this community and this state and for this country and for our students and what they contribute, and to members of the community who are here tonight. I appreciate all of you, and thank you very much for coming. I want to first thank those who organized this event tonight. It takes a lot of effort and organization to pull one of these things together. So all of you who had so much to do with this, thank you. I want to congratulate the University of Nebraska Omaha also for the historic federal grant that was announced yesterday. $36 million Department of Homeland Security grant to make this university the center of excellence in anti-terrorism research. That is a big deal, not just because $36 million is a pretty significant grant, but what it says about this school, about this community, about this state. That decision was made, and Secretary Kerry and I know how those decisions are made. It was made based on a number of factors. And this community should be very proud to have been given this grant, because it means more than just the $36 million that will come in on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security and security for our country. There are tangential benefits, huge, that come with this. Now, my assignment tonight is to introduce Secretary John Kerry. John Kerry, as you know, is a decorated Vietnam veteran. He's a former prosecutor, former lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, former senator, and former secretary of the state. That's not a bad resume. And I am particularly proud and privileged that he would accept our invitation to come tonight and be part of and be the centerpiece of this forum. I don't know of anybody that I've worked with over my years in the Senate, all the different things I've had the privilege to do, who embodies, understands, and represents global leadership more than John Kerry. I mean, he's actually done it in so many different ways. And the high regard that he has held all over the world, the accomplishments that he achieved in the 4 years that he was Secretary of State, one being the Iranian nuclear agreement, an amazing agreement, and what it took to get that done. 6 nations, all part of it: Russia, China, and not easy to deal with, Iran, and our allies, France, Germany, Great Britain, the United Nations as part of it, NATO. That's just but one example of a tangible result of his understanding of global leadership, his appreciation, the respect he has among the world's leaders, and the tenacity that he brings to any job. So it really is a privilege for me to be able to introduce him. I had to encourage him just a little to come to Nebraska with the promise of Platte River lobster. He was not aware of that delicacy, but I assure you that we come up with something. So it may be a can of sardines tonight, but this Boston boy will be classed up in any event, as I assured some of our former colleagues. So, ladies and gentlemen, it truly is an honor to present and introduce you to my former Senate colleague and dear friend, fellow Vietnam veteran, and fellow cabinet member, John Kerry.
Good evening, everybody. Vice Chancellor Kopp and members of the faculty and students, members of the community, greater community in Omaha, and students. Really delighted to be here with all of you. What a pleasure to be introduced by my pal, Chuck Hagel. Chuck and I and Bob Kerry and a few of us who were veterans of Vietnam caused a lot of problems in the United States Senate together. We were all mavericks, folks. I want you to know we took great pleasure in being mavericks, and I love the nickname. I think it's fantastic and appropriate. I understand he was promising you Platte River lobster while I was back there. But lobster sounds good to me, one form or another tonight. Anyway, I'm really, really happy to be here with you. And since I'm a truth teller, I will tell you that after 28 years in the United States Senate, and given where it is today, I'm delighted to be invited anywhere, folks. It's a blessing. I have to tell you a story. I'm going to share a story with you. We have to have some fun, even as we're being serious tonight. We're going to be serious tonight because we got some serious challenges. But there's a great story. I think Chuck may know this story. It's one of the great stories, I think, in politics. But I was looking for an opening, and what I could hear of Chuck's introduction of me, and the best I could get was the lobster piece, because that's all I heard. But I want to tell you a story about William Howard Taft, who visited upstate New York way back when. I mean, Taft was president, 1912, somewhere around there. And back then, obviously, pre-TV and pre-radio and so forth, the way you made your reputation in politics was on the circuit, speaking, going from one town to another. And one night, Taft was being celebrated in upstate New York, and he was sitting on a dais like this. All across the dais, there was a long, big white tablecloths, all the politicians, everybody was there. And the senator from New York back then was a fellow by the name of Chauncey Depew, who was chosen to do the introduction. And man, he got wound up. This was his opportunity. So at that point in his life, William Howard Taft was a man of considerable girth, folks. The closest he could get to the table was about back where I am here, and it was over here. And so, Chauncey Depew's getting wound up. Ladies and gentlemen, we are so honored to have, all that language. President of the United States is here. I want you to just look at him sitting there, pregnant, with hope. President of the United States, pregnant, with courage. And then he gets finally to introducing Taft. And Taft, man, by then he says, I got to manage this. And he kind of gets up and he protrudes even a little farther, and he rubs his tummy a little as he's walking up. And he gets up there and he says, ladies and gentlemen, pregnant, eh? Well, I have news for you. If it is to be a boy, we will call him Courage. And if it is to be a girl, we will call her Hope. But if, as I suspect, it is merely gas, we will call it Chauncey Depew. I said we got some fun with this. We have to have some fun. So let me get to the serious part of tonight, and begin by first of all saying what an honor it is to be in a program that Chuck is engaged in. I know so many of Chuck's political family are here tonight, and real family. one of his brothers, and it's an honor for me to be here with Chuck. Chuck is one of those people who stood out in Washington for his common sense. Probably good old Nebraska common sense, I imagine. It's prairie common sense. And he, people listened to him because he was a guy who could work with Democrats, work with Republicans, work with far right, left. He was looking for solutions to things. And I think Nebraska was enormously well-served to have a senator like that. By the way, also worked very closely with Ben Nelson, very closely with Bob Kerry. And you guys have exhibited, I think, great thought and sensitivity and even prescience in the people you've chosen to send to Washington. Well represented. But Chuck obviously was part of our small caucus, Bob Kerry, myself, Chuck Robb, Max Cleland, all of us who had served in Vietnam. And unlike World War II, it was a smaller caucus than previously. But we had a common belief shared through the crucible of a tough war, a war that tore our country apart as much as anything since the Civil War. And we always tried to make certain that, particularly in foreign affairs, that decisions were made guaranteeing that we had exhausted every remedy available to us before we asked young men and women to go off and die in another country. And I think we're well served today to think about that as we look at an 18-year war in Afghanistan and what happened in Iraq and what happened in Libya and other places, Syria, for instance. There's a lot to chew on, my friends. But what I want to do tonight is, because I don't want to talk too long, I really want to try to be limited here so we can get into the Q&A and talk to you guys as much as possible. And I hope you'll throw a lot of tough questions at us and we can really dig in. Why do I say that? I say that because we're in trouble in the United States of America. We have a brilliant democracy. I was privileged to serve as the 68th Secretary of State and to represent our country in diplomacy and work with Chuck and the State Department and the Defense Department because there's great unity in today's world for the things we have to do together. And there's no job in the world, I think, including President of the United States, which is as focused day to day on the ability to make peace, or the ability to diffuse a crisis, or the work that we have to do. The president, has got a bigger plate, a lot of things he's got to do. Mess with Congress, get out in the country, raise money, do all these other crazy things. And for the secretary, it's just to focus every day on how do you solve this problem? How do we make peace? How do we move things? And I love that. But I will tell you, folks, I'm teaching a class at Yale University right now on American power in the 21st century and the tools of diplomacy. And one of the things that keeps coming back to me is the degree to which things don't happen unless the United States of America leads. And that's not a matter of arrogance. I'm particularly sensitive to this question of arrogance. Because when you talk about your major policy being America first, that's the policy of every president in every country in the world, but people are smart enough not to talk about it that way. Because when you start talking about it that way, you turn a lot of folks off that you need to bring to the table. Humility is a critical component of good diplomacy. Listening is a critical component of good diplomacy. And so I believe we're in a dangerous place in our country for a number of reasons, not all related to foreign policy and to the issues I'll talk about tonight. But folks, our democracy is not working very well. And anybody who kids themselves and suggests otherwise is not telling the truth to themselves or to our fellow citizens. There's too much money in American politics. And if we're going to restore the voices of average folks who work their tails off to live by the rules of the American dream, we got to make this country fair again. And you cannot be a country where 51% of all the income of our nation goes to 1% of the country. That is not a political equation. For you who study political science and politics and psychology and other things, that is not a durable, enduring political equation. That's a recipe ultimately for revolution. And that's why people are angry. That's why they're angry on the right, they're angry on the left, they're angry in the center. The anger is not reserved for one party or another. And part of what gave us the president we have today is a reflection of that anger that comes from the reality that with globalization, with this massive transformation in our culture, the assault on culture, if you will, we are seeing greater problems in people being able to sort of figure out where they fit and how they fit. And the rules are being differently applied to different layers and different people. You know it as well as I do. So building the fabric of the nation is really critical. Now, that's one set of challenges we face. I'm not going to go into all the aspects of it now, except to say that in the age of the internet, in the age of globalization, of trading massive amounts with 95% of the world's customers in other countries, we are seeing tectonic cultural, political, economic, warfare transformations that are altering the possibilities of the way we think about things. And it's happening. These shifts, by the way, are just as big as the transformations our nation went through in the Industrial Revolution. But big difference. This is happening at tectonic pace, at digital pace. And it is happening in a way that with the internet and with the disintermediation of communications. I mean, now we don't even have a referee for the truth the way we did. When you and I grew up, Chuck, and others in here, you had three major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And then you had public television and public radio. That was it. And when President Nixon or President Johnson or President Kennedy said, I want to talk to the nation, they talked to the nation. And the next morning, the conversations at work, because people went to work back then. You didn't have this. You worked from your home, worked from anywhere nowadays. So people went to work and they actually gathered around a coffee cooler or whatever, water cooler and the coffee. We got to get going here. And they'd have a conversation about what the president said. That doesn't happen anymore. You get a lot of tweets out there, and some of the most extraordinary, rude, unbelievably assaultive, disrespectful things you've ever read. That's what goes on. Shouting match, feeding, this feeding frenzy. Almost look at what the debate was like the other night. So, my friends, we have to get away from that. Now, we can get away from that. I'm going to talk about that a bit tonight. But let me get to sort of the big global issue. We got coronavirus coming at us. We got cyber warfare. We have nuclear weapons, Pakistan, India, Iran, others who may think they need them, North Korea. This is something we worked on far more thoughtfully and intelligently in the 1960s and 70s and 80s than we are today. We're not working on it now. In the Obama administration, we began a discussion about how to deal with cyber. We worked with the Chinese and actually set out some initial concepts which would coordinate efforts on a global basis. Nobody's followed up on it. Nothing's happening. But here's what I want to put to you is perhaps the biggest choice we have ever faced as a generation, as a nation, as a world. By the way, every single one of those things I just listed, and there are more. 2 billion children, ages 15 and less, 1.8 billion precisely, in the world, mostly in the Middle East, South Central Asia, and north of Africa. 2 billion people between the age of 15 and 25, the mischief years, the difficult years, who are not enfranchised in their countries. And it is not a problem, my friends, that's just over there. There's no over there anymore. It's everywhere. Transboundary disease, Ebola, AIDS, coronavirus now. We can talk about it later. But here's what I want to get to. I've worked for about 35 years or more, whatever 1988 works out to. But before that, when I was Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, I led a national governor's task force to deal with acid rain. You don't hear about acid rain. Why? It was killing our lakes and streams. It was a global issue because we dealt with it. We had a bipartisan effort. I worked with John Sununu, the governor of New Hampshire, Dick Celeste, the governor of Ohio, and we put together a thing called Cap and Trade. You know where it came from? The American Enterprise Institute. It was a market-based solution to the problem, where you would trade sulfur and people therefore would have a motive to begin to lower it. The price went up for doing those businesses, and the marketplace solved the problem. Conservative idea. And now, unfortunately, some conservatives on the far right have jumped on it and called it government intervention. And you can't even talk about it. It's a non-starter to try to deal with the problem of carbon or methane or other things. Now, that was the 80s. In 1988, Al Gore, myself, Senator Worth from Colorado, a bunch of us became involved with the question of climate change. Back then it was climate change. Now, believe me, it is the climate crisis beyond all crises. I want to talk about it for a minute. In 1992, we went down to Rio, a group of us, with President George H.W. Bush. And his administration negotiated a voluntary agreement to deal with climate. But it was voluntary. A whole bunch of nations didn't do anything. In 1997, because of the failure of the voluntary, we did Kyoto. Kyoto was mandatory. But because people didn't think China was doing enough, or India, they said, well, we're not going to do anything. And so nothing happened. So ultimately, we get into the 2000s. I've been to most of the conferences of the parties. I was just in Madrid in December, where they failed to be able to do what we promised we would do in Paris, which is to hold countries accountable for the reductions that they promised, the reductions in emissions. Now, I had the privilege of negotiating the Paris Agreement for the United States. And when I became Secretary of State, the very first thing I did, within 6 weeks of being Secretary, I went to China. Why? Because I knew if we didn't get the Chinese on board, we weren't going to do anything. It was sort of a lesson in Kyoto. So I also knew the Chinese. I worked with them as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. I had a sense of how to do this. And I sat down with President Xi one-on-one, and I said, Mr. President, China has to lead here. You're going to be the biggest economy in the world. You got to help the world to be able to solve the problem. And your people have bad air and bad water, and they're as concerned about how they live as people in any other country. So we set up a task force. For 1 year, we worked together. And at the end of that year, President Obama and President Xi stood up in the Great Hall of the People and announced what they would reduce each of their countries, the United States and China. And that unleashed the dam. Europe came on board. We managed to fight to bring Saudi Arabia on board. We brought Australia on board, Brazil on board, India on board. Wasn't easy. It's called diplomacy. You don't see it now. President of the United States decided, I'm just pulling out. I don't like it. I don't think he read it or understood it, but he pulled out of it. And I know he lied to the American people. I'm not here to be partisan, but he didn't tell the truth to the American people when he got out, because what he said was, this is placing too great a burden on our country. Remember that? But my friends, it didn't place any burden on our country, because we wrote our own plan. And you know who we wrote it with? With the support of Chevron and Shell and BP and ExxonMobil, all of whom were in Paris helping to pass this. They were ready to accept the price on carbon. And we did it with the support of Google and Microsoft, and Fortune 500 companies came to the table and said, we want this, we need this. Bank of America put $125 billion on the table to help with renewable and alternative energy. And what we were facing was an opportunity for the greatest market the world has ever known. Farmers out here in the Midwest could be making huge sums of money dealing with this. Huge advantages to dealing with carbon, to producing, moving to alternative renewables, to doing regenerative agriculture, countless opportunities, not to mention the technology sides of it. So in Paris, we came to an agreement, and the agreement was that we were all going to reduce. With the understanding that what we were really doing, ladies and gentlemen, was sending a signal to the marketplace. We did not guarantee, nor did we pretend to, that we were reducing, that we were going to hold the Earth's temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade, let alone 1.5. That's not what was the promise to Paris. The promise of Paris was 196 countries have come together, and each of them is going to do everything they can to move rapidly to hold the emissions down, and that was going to excite the marketplace. This massive 4.5 to 5 billion user market of trillions of dollars. Just to give you a comparison, I represented Massachusetts for 28 years. We have high tech, we have MIT, we got Harvard, we got a lot of places that work on this all the time. And in the 1990s, Massachusetts and California and Texas and a few places became really wealthy. Individuals became wealthy too, because we had the tech boom of communications and computers on the desk, et cetera, right? Remember that. You know what that was? It was a $1 trillion market with 1 billion users. The energy market today, which is the solution to climate change, there is a solution. It's energy policy. And that market is 4 to 5 billion users today, and is going up to 9 billion users in the next 30 years. That's what we're going to have on planet Earth, depending obviously on coronaviruses and other things. But the reality is that this is one of the greatest opportunities we could ever have, folks. Solar has come down now to about 3 cents a kilowatt hour, 2 cents a kilowatt hour in some places. 89% reduction in the cost of solar, because that's what technology does. Moore's law, the whole advance of new solutions. Wind has come way down. Totally competitive. Wind and solar beat coal by far. The problem is you have to have your base load taken care of for companies that are producing things. If the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining at night, you have to have this transitional capacity. So we need to push the battery storage solution. And anybody who comes up with a 20-day battery storage has solved the problem of climate change. Are we putting billions and billions of dollars into that? No. Have we created a $1 billion prize for the person who breaks through? No. We should. There are all kinds of ways to make things happen faster. A consortium of universities, a consortium of countries. China, Russia, US, Britain, Germany, France, other technology-based countries, Israel, could come together and start pushing this curve. That's what we need to do, folks. And why do we need to do it? Let me tell you. I became the only Secretary of State to ever go to Antarctica. I didn't just go for a joyride. I went because I was on a trip to the Arctic, because I wanted to learn. And I listened to the scientists, and the scientists said to me, Mr. Secretary, if you really want to understand the canary in the coal mine and see what's happening on climate, you got to go to Antarctica. I went back to Washington and walked in this Oval Office and said, Mr. President, I'm going to go to Antarctica if it's okay with you. He said, I'd love to go with you. He would have loved me that, but he couldn't, obviously, but I went. And folks, what I saw there was just really frightening. You know, it was 70 degrees last week in Antarctica. 70 degrees. I saw a fissure in the great West Antarctic ice sheet. You can visibly see it where the instability of the ice is growing. We lost a whole sheet of ice the size of the state of Rhode Island, broke off a couple of years ago, called the Larsen ice sheet, floats out to sea to melt. In the Arctic, by the way, I went up over the Greenland. I landed and put down on the Greenland ice sheet and looked down a hole 100 feet deep, and you see this torrential river flowing underneath the ice, heading out to sea, melting away. I watched the calving of ice in a particular fjord where 86 million metric tons of ice a day is breaking off and going out to sea to melt. Now, to give you a reference point for that, 86 million metric tons a day is enough water for greater New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut for an entire year, every day. Now, other things are happening. We just read in the newspapers a few days ago that the currents of the ocean are now moving 76% faster. That was predicted by scientists to happen at the end of the century. It's already happened. I've seen methane bubbling up in the water where scientists will take a match and light the bubbles and it lights on fire. Methane is 20 times more damaging than CO2. And as the permafrost is thawing in Alaska, in Siberia, you're going to have methane coming up, and we don't know how to control that. We don't know how to tame it yet. 20 times more damaging than CO2. In the Antarctic, you have water flowing over the continental shelf underneath the ice, which is warmer and creating instability in that ice, melting it faster. And you put all of these things together, folks, as any reasonable person would do. And this, last January, this one we just had, is now the hottest January in the history of human measurement. One day in January was the hottest day ever in human measurement. The decade, going back from now, 10 years, is the hottest decade in human history. And guess what? No surprise, the decade before that is the second hottest in human history. And the decade before that is the third hottest in human history. You get the drift? Kids in high school understand this. But until recently, our president has been saying it's a Chinese hoax. Until about 4 weeks ago, when suddenly he may be perceiving it's percolating in body politic, and maybe they ought to do something. They're not doing it. Nothing real. When I was in Madrid in December of this year, where we were going to try to get accountability from countries for what they were doing, that's all we were doing. No new benchmarks, no advance forward, just how do we account for what each country is doing so it's fair and we really know what's happening. You know what happened? It failed. We couldn't get it done. 3 countries blocked it. Australia, just as the fires were beginning to take hold. Brazil, which has had its share of fires in the Amazon, and which has been a problem in the policy of that country. And I regret to tell you, the United States of America. So my friends, look, I'm not an ideologue at all. I'm a practical person, and I've gone to both sides of the aisle to try to solve problems. What disturbs me is that climate change is solvable. What President Kennedy told us years ago, all the problems on Earth are basically human created. Obviously not an earthquake, not a tsunami, but all the problems we face societally and in decisions we make politically, they're human created. And therefore they're subject to human solution. I believe that. I know we can solve the problem of climate. I know we can still solve the problem of climate, but only if we listen to the scientists and do what they told us to do, which is recognize we have 12 years, that was 2 years ago, now 10 years, in order to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. And bluntly said to you, on the rate we're going now, folks, we're not going to hold it to 1.5, and we're not going to hold it to 2. You know where we are now? About 1 degree to 1.1, somewhere in there of warming. So we're not even at 1.5 yet, let alone 2. And here's the really harsh news, which ought to compel people to get active. In Paris, we, as I said, were trying to send a signal to the marketplace. We were not able, because everybody wanted to do it according to what they thought they could do, not a mandatory thing. So the best we could do was target what we targeted. You know where we go? You hear people that are running for office, they say, first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to rejoin the Paris Agreement. Yeah, it's good to rejoin it, but I got news for you. If we do everything that every country promised to do in the Paris Agreement, we are seeing a 3.7 degree centigrade rise in the temperature of Earth. Catastrophic. The only problem is, my friends, no country in the world is getting the job done. None. No country in the world is living sustainably. No country in the world is getting their emissions reduced to what they said they would do. We are actually heading over 4 degrees, 4 to 4.5. Don't question me. You can Google and talk, you can connect with the Potsdam Institute, where a very well-known scientist who spent his lifetime working with the UN and others, Johan Rockström, will tell you all the indicators indicate that's the road we're on. Now, we don't have to be. How do we change this? The President of the United States ought to call every one of the auto manufacturers into the White House, sit them down and say, okay, here's the science, and we have 10 years, and I want to know what you need to be able to move us to electric faster. How do we accelerate batteries? How do we accelerate the transition? How do we help people who can't afford an electric car to buy one? So let's create the subsidy. We subsidize fossil fuels still. We're not subsidizing the transition. And the fact is that if we don't do that, we're going to face unbelievable disruption on the planet. There are places that are already feeling it. I talked 2 days ago, 3 days ago, with the president of Palau, who are going to have the next conference on oceans, which I started at the State Department. Palau, 20 years ago, he was talking about mitigation, adaptation. That's no longer an option. Now you know what he's talking about? Where do I move my people? Where do I take my nation to live? Going to disappear. Bangladesh. South Florida, by the way. The mayor of Miami Miami Beach, already pumping water out on a sunny day and a high tide, and it's going to get worse. But worse than that, you're going to have dislocation in the production of food. You already see the Himalayan mountain ice retreating. You see ice all over the world retreating. The president of France went to do a visit to Mont Blanc, where the massive glacier of Mont Blanc has gone back 200 yards or more. So, my friends, I don't do this. I don't sit here. I do not retreat and say to myself, oh my God, we're not going to be able to do this. Wrong. What's lacking is not the capacity, it's the willpower. It's the political decision and leadership. And then after you get those people in the White House, you decide, okay, here's what we need. Then you have to have all the great builders of America. Every country, every state in our country has great builders. They got to come in and say, how fast can we build out the infrastructure for the charging stations and the superchargers? So no family has to say, God, I can't get to the hospital. I won't be able to drive to work. I won't be able to take my kids to school. All these normal, regular things we do. You can do all of them. The person who makes that BMW in South Carolina today can make a BMW that doesn't have an internal combustion engine but has a battery in it. And we'll sell just as many of them. In fact, millions now, because everybody's going to have to transition to this. So, my friends, this is so winnable. But it's only going to be winnable if we, to come back to my opening comments, make our democracy work. I'm going to close on this before we get into Q&A. Okay, John Kerry, you're here in Nebraska, and you can stand up there, tell everybody, hey, we got to make this work, blah, blah, blah. But how do you know really that will work? How do you know you can make that difference? Well, let me tell you something. When I first came back from Vietnam, 1969 spring, while I became very well known, some might say notorious, for opposing the war, having been there, telling the truth about it. I don't think anybody today would question that what I said was true. But back then it was controversial in our country. The country was divided still. But before I did that, you know what I did? I became involved in something called Earth Day. How many of you here were involved in Earth Day back then? I see a few hands there. Raise your hands, be proud of it. Come on. Look at all these folks. They were ahead of the curve back then, and you know what they did? Together, we brought 20 million Americans out of their homes on the same day, 22nd of April, 1970. And they sent a message to the governing class, hey, folks, wake up. We don't want to live next to a toxic waste site. We don't want to live next to a dump that gives us cancer, our children. We don't want to drink water that's polluted. We want to be able to see across our city, New York, Los Angeles. You literally couldn't see from one side to the other. And so we made it a political movement. We didn't just come out and demonstrate. We urged people to vote. We targeted the 12 worst votes in the US Congress. We labeled them the Dirty Dozen. Remember the movie? Telly Savalas, Dave Brown, a bunch of people. And guess what? We defeated 7 of the 12. As Chuck will tell you, there is nothing like a bunch of your colleagues disappearing because they were voted out of office to stiffen the spines of the survivors. And that's exactly what happened. It was a voting issue. And even Richard Nixon, who was not an environmentalist, saw the power of the movement of people who wanted to have these things, and he moved on it. Spent 1,000 words of his State of the Union message to say, we can do this. And we're going to do these things. You know what we did right then and there, 1972, 73? We passed the Clean Air Act. We passed the Safe Drinking Water Act, Marine Mammal Protection, Coastal Zone Management, Endangered Species. And we created something we didn't even have in America. The Environmental Protection Agency. It was created then, signed by Nixon, and became how we lowered emissions and began to do things. So, voting issue, right? Well, let me tell you about 2016. When I ran for president in 2004 with George Bush, I was the silver medalist that year, by the way, folks. I just wanted to understand. But we had a turnout of about 62.3% or so. 4 years later, when Barack Obama got elected president, the turnout was 63.7. You know what it was in 2016? With all of these big issues on the table? 55.6%. That is all the eligible voters in America who wanted to come out and vote. And then they'll go home and complain about our democracy. Or they'll say, gee, Washington didn't work, or I don't like people there. Well, folks, here's the worst figure of all. The young folks who have the greatest stake in this, who are now leading climate strike and Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion, all of which are terrific efforts. But if you can't vote, don't get people to vote, you can be disappointed. And that's when you breed radical, disenchanted, and your system falls apart. So the eligible vote, the percentage of eligible people, 18 years to 25, that voted in 2016 was 19%. 19%. And in 2018, when the House was won back by the Democrats, it went up to 31%. But obviously, mathematicians that you all are, you know that that still means that 69% are not voting. Now, you've been an observer in an election, I think, in another country. I've stood there in Sudan, in Philippines, in Kenya, in the West Bank, where people wait all day long to vote, to get a little ink imprint on their thumb to proudly say I voted. I went up to one person in Sudan to apologize that they were waiting 5 to 6 hours to get and vote. And they said to me, Senator, I was chairman then, they said, are you kidding? I've waited 50 years to be here. 5 hours is nothing. We don't have that attitude. And I am absolutely convinced that when you see the polling data that says that 70% of Americans are concerned about climate, we ought to have 60 something, 50, whatever, and you watch. See change of what is available to us and what happens and what we do. So I'll reserve till we get in the Q&A some of the sectors of our economy that provide us with huge opportunities here to make money and do things that are going to be very, very exciting. I see this as an exciting future, but only if we actually make decisions. We cannot afford to continue to deny the realities of the future. Unless you think this is just John Kerry telling you this, and that it's not related to what I said in the beginning, let me just leave you with this notion. When our founding fathers finished their extraordinary work in Philadelphia at Constitution Hall, nobody quite knew, you know, there was a huge debate. For those of you who read the Federalist Papers and the great tension of Madison and Hamilton, which is now, because of the play Hamilton, people are more aware of. But it was a huge debate. Big government, small government, how much government, what do you do? But nobody knew whether it was going to be even a monarchy. So Ben Franklin walked out of that hall late at night after they had finished the deal. And the crowd had gathered, knowing that they were near the end of their work. And a woman shouted at him, "Tell us, Dr. Franklin, what do we have? A monarchy or a republic?" And he shouted back at her, "A republic, if you can keep it." Those are his words, 1787. If you can keep it. He's talking to you and me and all of us. I thought I was going to be retired by now, folks. But I'm out here. We have to go fight to do what we did in 1970. We have to fight to restore our democracy in this country. We have to make climate the voting issue it ought to be, because it's existential. And we have to restore the democracy of the United States of America by heeding the words of Franklin, if you can keep it. That's you. Thank you. Thank you very much for a very generous response. And I'm going to destroy the atmosphere by telling you that Winston Churchill once said, the only reason people give a standing ovation is they desperately need an excuse to ship their underwear. I know you have a much more noble. Anyway.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Beth Chalecki from the UNO Political Science Department, and I am going to be the moderator for the Q&A portion of the evening. The theme for the Hagel Forum of Global Leadership is the role of U.S. leadership in a changing world. And we began the 21st century at the very apex of our political and economic power. The Cold War was over, and the nuclear threat was reduced. Global trade and the economy were increasing, and human rights concerns were being taken seriously all around the world. And then the road got rocky. The past years have seen unparalleled turnover within the US government, trepidation on the part of our allies, and an embrace of dictators and autocrats around the world. The coronavirus wreaks havoc on people's lives and the stock market, and currently carbon dioxide is 414 parts per million in the atmosphere, an increase of almost 48% since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and it continues to rise. These global problems are interrelated and complex, as we have heard, and just when US leadership is needed more than ever, it appears more uncertain than ever. So with this in mind, I want to welcome you to the moderated Q&A portion with the Honorable John Kerry, the Honorable Chuck Hagel, and myself. The UNO students, faculty, staff, and the Omaha community have submitted questions online, and we'll begin with Senator Hagel. Sir, As a former senator and former cabinet secretary serving in Republican and Democratic administrations, you have a unique and multi-sided view of the American role in the world. Omaha community member Elizabeth Morris writes, what short and long-term steps do you feel should be taken to return the United States to being a positive contributor and influence globally?
Thank you. And if you were here, thank you for the question. John, thanks for your comments. I would answer the question this way. If we return to a world right after World War II, the 10-year period, where we, the United States, led the rest of the world in establishing a new world order, a liberal world order. It was based on one foundational concept, common interests. The common interest of all people. Not that we all had the same interest all the time on every issue. We don't. But there are so many common interests for all people of the world that we built the United Nations. We built the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is now WTO. We built dozens of international development banks and institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, other global institutions. That allowed us, plus the collective security organizations, NATO specifically, but that allowed us the time, the forum, and the opportunity to bring nations together to work out differences rather than sending wars against each other, which had been the first 50 years of the 20th century. So when we talk about global leadership, what do we have to get back to? It seems to me we've got to reread history, and a good book to read about that is Dean Acheson's book, President Creation. One of John's predecessors as Secretary of State, because in that book, he charts through those 10 years after World War II, and he was a big part of all that. And why did we build those institutions? And why did we bring people together? And only the United States could do that. And today, only the United States can do it too. China is large, big economy, it's powerful, but only the United States has the kind of system, first of all, that people trust and have confidence in, democracy. And it doesn't mean we're always right, or we don't make mistakes, we do. In our economy, our power, and it's more so today than ever before, and needed more today, not to dictate to other people, not to tell people what to do or impose our will or invade and occupy, but to bring people together in a common interest of all nations. And John Kerry's comments here just a few minutes ago, there's no greater common interest that all people in the world have than climate, for all the reasons John talked about and more. Another offshoot of that is obviously pandemic health issues. And the coronavirus could very well be one of those right at the beginning of this early part of the century. So for all those reasons, the United States leadership is indispensable.
Senator Kerry, positive contributor and influence globally. What are some of the steps that we can take to get back there? Same question to Senator Hagel.
Well, let me emphasize, as Chuck did, my mother was born in Paris. My grandfather was internationally involved in business at the time, 1920s, 1915, and leading up to the war. And the war and all wars, the First World War, which was just a horrendous, stupid war of mistakes and miscalculation, but which just lost to generations, took place. So you have to look at that as sort of the prelude to what Chuck was talking about. And then in the 1920s, and there were about 15 democracies in the world. That was it at the end of World War I. The 1920s, 30s produced what was then deemed to be the failure of capitalism. Because you had the 29 crash, people of the Great Depression, a terrible time, and that's when fascism and communism were on the rise as the alternative to that. And then, of course, World War II took place, which was really the unfinished business of a incomplete peace that was negotiated in Paris. So then you come into World War II. We win. The United States of America is dragged out of our fundamentally isolationist bent, and we lead the effort to win the war, unconditional surrender. And then we set a standard above all standards I've ever contemplated. We turn around and we give money to Japan and we give money to Germany and we rebuild them. We help them write a constitution. And look today, the strongest allies we have in the world are Japan and Germany, and one of the two very vibrant democracies and very vibrant economies. That's the meaning of the world that Chuck referred to about WTO, everything that followed, the international financial institutions, the World Bank, the UN. We put together a system that frankly has done an amazing job of lifting the standard of living, of helping people to have a better future. Look at Europe. I hate to say this, but they probably have the best healthcare outcomes in the world. We don't. We spend more money, but we don't have better outcomes. They have incredible standard of living, good vacations, paid time, this, that. It's worth fighting for. But along comes the end of the Soviet Union, which Vladimir Putin still says is the greatest tragedy of the last century, was the loss of the Soviet Union. And he's, beg pardon?
You would say that.
Well, he not only says that, but this is where the world is dangerous today. All of that effort to win the war, to build the future, to set a structure, to establish rights for human beings, to have entities that could enforce those rights, the Council of Human Rights, the International Criminal Court, all these things, is at risk today. And you have Putin and Xi. I've been at this conference. I have heard these conferences. I've heard the Russian delegation come in and stand up and say, with us sitting there, America is in decline. The West, the liberal order of the West has been proven to be ineffective. Doesn't work. We are the future. Xi says it, Putin says it, and that's the new narrative that is being marketed globally. And what are we doing to counter that with the value of the sacrifice of those soldiers at Omaha Beach and these other extraordinary battles of World War II, and defeating fascism and defeating tyranny and winning the future for democracy? We turn around and throw our entire intelligence community under the table and say we have no reason to believe that somehow Putin had a reason to interfere in our election, even as we know he's doing it today. And so we've got to get our act together to reassert the values that Chuck was talking about.
That's a perfect segue to the next question. UNO Senior Yusuf Khan asks, how will Republican and Democratic politicians in the near future be able to work together, given the, quote, immense vitriol and toxicity the current administration will leave behind? And on a related note, Omaha community member Clinton Peterson writes, do you believe we can bridge the political divide that exists today? I am becoming more and more pessimistic. Senator Kerry.
Yes, I believe we can, and I believe we ultimately will. We've gone through cycles in America. We've had bad moments before. The 1919 Red Scare, we've had Joe McCarthy in the 1950s, another Red Scare. We had 1968. We had assassination of Medgar Evers, a civil rights advocate, then Martin Luther King, and then Bobby Kennedy, 5 years after the assassination of our president. And we had pipe bombs going off in the streets of America. We had cities that were burning, Los Angeles, Detroit. We had, insurrectionists with machine guns battling the police in places in America. We came out of that. As Gerald Ford, said, America's long nightmare is over. That was when we held the president accountable for lying to the American people and breaking the law. So can we come back to it? Yes, but here to me is the key ingredient. I hope Chuck would agree with this. I don't think the Senate rules, the House rules have changed so dramatically that it preordains that we have to do what we're doing. I think the people have changed. The people. When George Mitchell became the majority leader of the United States Senate, Democrat, he walked over to Bob Dole, the minority leader's office, sat down with him and said, Bob, I tell you what, We got to run the world's greatest deliberative body. We have to uphold the institution. I will never surprise you. I will never pull the rug out from under you. I'll never betray you. I'll never ambush you. And you have to make the same agreement to me. We talk to each other. We talk about how the Senate will do its business, and everybody will get a fair shot.
But we couldn't do that now.
Two leaders. The two leaders today can't even talk to each other, basically. And there's no such discussion. Why? I'll tell you why. Because the money in American politics is so concentrated now in certain hands that it reinforces a perpetual election. And what we need to do is have leaders who are willing to stand up and organize America's election, if you will, where the people, where you speak about what you want, where you make sure the people who are running are people who are going to agree they're going to work across the aisle. People who will actually uphold the Constitution, not be, as we've just seen, more concerned about party and personal power and president than they are about upholding the Constitution of the United States and the oath they take to do so. I'm flabbergasted by it, that only one Republican saw fit to stand up and do that. Now, I don't say this partisanly. I mean, I'm not partisan in that way. John McCain and I worked together. We sat opposite each other on a flight to Kuwait. We talked about Vietnam. We were in totally polar opposites. He was a POW. I was a protester. We were suspicious of each other, but we both knew we had to end the war in America over the war in Vietnam. It was still a war. So we said, let's work at this. For 10 years, John and I traveled together, worked together. We headed up a committee that did a finding that there were not prisoners still alive in Vietnam, which was the absolute predicate to being able to lift the embargo and move to strengthen our relationship with Vietnam. And ladies and gentlemen, one of the most moving things that ever happened to me as a senator in my post-Vietnam life. I was chairman of the committee. I took John and others to Hanoi, and I went to visit the Hanoi Hilton, the prison where John McCain was imprisoned for 5 years or whatever of his life, 2 years in this one cell, and where he was tortured, but had never lost his sense of honor. And I stood there with John in that cell, and I thought to myself as we talked, I said, my God, who could imagine the protester and the POW together in the very cell he spent time, working on the same thing, crossing the divide, taking arrows from both sides for doing it. And you know what we did? We won. We did make peace. And if a protester and a POW can come together in those circumstances, in that place, United States senators ought to be able to come together in the United States Senate. We should be able to solve any problem that we have in this country. It's the people. They have to want to do it, and they have to push back against the power centers of money that's distorting America's democracy.
All right, thank you. The Middle East. Senator Kerry negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the Iran nuclear deal, in 2015. For 2 years, Iran was certified in compliance. Then President Trump withdrew in 2018, even though every other member of the P5+1 urged him not to. What's the future of the JCPOA and Iran's nuclear ambitions?
Well, just to add to that, that it wasn't just the other countries that said don't pull out. A distinguished Marine four-star general, Jim Mattis, who was Secretary of Defense, said don't pull out. A very successful American businessman who was the CEO of ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson, who happened to be Secretary of State, said don't pull out. Our entire intelligence community said don't pull out. We know what we can do. And I mean, I ask you just folks, as a matter of common sense, we had Iran destroyed the means of their enriching materials. They destroyed 22,000 centrifuges. They completely destroyed a plutonium reactor. They got rid of all but 300 kilograms of 12,000 kilograms of enriched material. They sent it to Russia. Russia destroyed it. They were limited to 3.67 degrees percentage of enrichment. You can't make a bomb at 367. And we had all the world united with us to try to put pressure on Iran to deal with Yemen, deal with Hezbollah, deal with missiles. We had a follow-on negotiation teed up. President Trump pulls out, gives credence to General Soleimani and the IRGC, the hardliners of Iran, who said, we don't support this agreement. We don't want to give up our right to have a weapon. We do not agree with negotiating with America. And despite the Ayatollah committing to negotiate with America against the warnings that you can't trust the great Satan, which they would call us, and they'll burn you, guess what happened? Donald Trump stepped up without any real rationale. He just pulls out. And everything that has happened since, the missiles, the ships being hurt, the bombing, the threat of war, the near reality of war was absolutely foreseeable and foreseen, which is why we did what we did. I want to tell you folks, the king of Saudi Arabia sat right where Chuck is, approximately from me in distance, and said, you have to bomb Iran. The president of Egypt, President Mubarak, said the same thing to me, you have to bomb Iran. And the prime minister of Israel came to America to get permission from President Obama to bomb Iran. And Obama didn't let it go forward. So we were in a place where everybody was pushing for war. We proved you can get rid of the nuclear weapon without going to war, at least for now, and creating a verification process where every day we have people on the ground, 130 strong, additional inspectors, looking at everything they're doing and being able to tell us that we know what they're doing. So our entire intelligence community, and the Russians, and the Chinese, and the French, Germans, and British, whom we do trust, all said, we'll know what's happening. Don't pull out. Work with us to get the follow-on agreement. Make the region safer. And if you can't get that agreement, in 10 years, 5 years, nothing would have changed. Then you can bomb them. Then you can have a war if you want to have a war. But the point is, we had a real opportunity, and now you say, what's going to happen to it? It really depends on the outcome of the election. The president gave to Iran the power to decide whether we would be at war, and I'll tell you exactly what I mean by that. When the assassination of General Soleimani took place, everyone knew Iran was going to have to retaliate. In effect, when they retaliated, we were lucky. They injured 64 people. By the way, the president minimized their injuries. TBI is a serious injury. Some people can never go back to work. Some people lose their families. They get depressed. They kill themselves. TBI is a life changer. And the president just called it headaches. And the reality
we could head off war if we wish to.
The reality is that if 2 Americans or 3 Americans have been killed, I guarantee you, tit for tat was demanded. We would have retaliated. We'd have been in a war. Absolutely. You don't give a regime you don't trust, and a regime that could be crazy, the right to decide whether or not you go to war, which is in fact what happened.
Senator Hagel, if Iran really wanted a nuclear weapon, does the United States stand any realistic chance of preventing it?
Well, I think what John has just said, yes. What John led in the Obama administration, the effort to get that agreement, which was historic for all the reasons John's noted, and everybody who knows the basics of the accomplishments of why that was so important and so important, we can accomplish that again. I think we can, depends on the leadership, depends on the next election. But here's the reason I say we can do it. Everybody wants that. I mean, our partners, the Chinese and the Russians want it. We're the only ones that undid that deal. The Iranians sure as hell want it. They got something out of the deal, and that's the reality of a good deal. Everybody's got to get something out of it. But one point I want to make, John alluded to it, but this is why it can be done as much as any other reason. Within Iran today, The demographics of Iran, the young people, are by far the majority. They want a different kind of world than the Ayatollah, than what they've had since 1979. That's a world they want to be closer to the West. They want economic opportunities and freedom and some semblance of democracy. Not necessarily our democracy. We make a mistake when we think we have to impose American democracy on everybody else. And our biggest foreign policy blunders have been based on that rationale. But what happened here, as much as anything else, when President Trump pulled out, he pulled the rug out from under all those moderates, those young people in Iran who said, no, let's give the West a chance. We can work something out. We can be stronger and a better country. So everybody wants this to happen again. It won't be easy. It can come back. And I would end this way. One of the greatest capacities that this country possesses, because we are a nation of laws, we have a constitution. I think this country is made up of good people, fair people, honest people, decent people. And I think it's always been that way, is that we have the capacity to self-correct. We have 27 amendments to the Constitution. We acknowledge that we didn't get it all right the first time.
And hopefully there'll be one more soon, right?
And, well, there'll be more than one, I think. And so we can self-correct. The world admires that. And we don't have to kill each other and go to revolution in the streets to do it. The world admires that. The world knows that we can do that, and we can help others do that.
Well, the people who are helping us self-correct might be in this room right now. So I'm going to go to the next question. This is for both of you gentlemen. Most American high school and college students have grown up in an inward-focused, sometimes highly ethnocentric school system. Globalism is for specific majors instead of being built into all areas of study. UNO senior Mars Nevada asks, how can leaders in education build a better foundation for global leadership no matter your major? And on a related note, UNO junior Joel Ochoa wants to know, in your opinion, what are the most important skills for someone pursuing a career in public service?
Well, take this second question. I think most important skills are honesty, character, courage, and judgment. And that requires, you've got to be honest with yourself. You've got to know yourself well enough. I'm not sure how old you ever get that you really know yourself completely. You're on an exploratory mission throughout life, and you find out about yourself. And if you're honest, you find some things about yourself that are not that attractive, and you got to work on it. And you're always surprised if you're honest with yourself. And the other part of that, at least in my opinion, if young people are interested in public service, know why you are interested in public service. I have said to John over the years, many young people ask me, what do you think about me running for office? Or I'd like to run for office. What do you think I need to know? And I tell them, you've got to answer one question first. And that will tell you whether you should run or not. And it's only a question that you can answer. And that's this: why do you want to do it? And if the answer is not to make a better world, then don't do it. If the answer is just your self-aggrandizement and because I'm pretty or I'm smart or I'm glib or it'll help me in business or I can use it the next step in life, don't waste people's time. Only one thing should propel you to run for office: make a better world. And I don't care what your position is on issues, as long as you believe it and you listen to people and you handle yourself, as John explained in his comments, where you respect other people and you know that you don't have all the answers. You're not that smart. Nobody is that smart. And you better understand that before you get started.
Senator Kerry, you have any comments you want to add?
Well, can you just clarify the first part of the question?
How can leaders in education build a better foundation for global leadership, no matter your major? Globalism seems to be something that's sort of compartmentalized.
I didn't want to go there. I just wanted to make sure of that. But first of all, I what I meant was, I didn't want to go there and not be answering the question. That would be first for Senator.
I can make that clock stop.
I love what Chuck said. I think Chuck gave a fabulous big picture assessment, which you ought to follow in terms of the courage and knowing yourself and so forth. I think, though, let me begin on the education. We're not doing as well as we should be. I mean, I'm just being honest about America's educational system. In some things we do brilliantly, in others we don't do what we ought to do. And one of the things we don't do is really prepare people to be global citizens. We need to, much more effectively. I don't think anybody should graduate from any high school anywhere in our nation without proficiency in at least 2 languages. That doesn't happen enough in enough places. And I think that it is imperative that people know how the rest of the world works, how people are living, what is the difference between the United States and our incredible, remarkable accomplishment. I mean, what we've done as a nation is really amazing, but we have to put it in a perspective relative to that. You know, I mean, there are 500 million, 450 million children who are never going to go to school in the world, ever, not going to go to school. Most of them in South Central Asia, Middle East, Horn of Africa. And that happens to be some of the hottest and most difficult places in terms of politics in the world, extremism. And it's not over there. There is no over there anymore. It's here. Everything comes here, one way or the other.
But globalism is now seen as a derogatory term.
Yes, it is.
If somebody is globalist, that's an insult.
You're absolutely correct. And that is because of what I described earlier. That is because of the trade relationship and/or politics that allowed central components of the community's economy to go to Mexico or leave and not have anything behind to take care of it. That's because there wasn't sufficient safety net training of people to be able to go on and have another career. You're 55 years old and you lose your job in America, it's tough to find another job. And that's what's happened to people. People are still angry appropriately in America over what happened in 2008. And who was punished for that? Nobody really visibly. Yeah, some folks lost some money, but a whole bunch of people kept a whole lot of money. But not average Americans, not most people, not people struggling to get into the working class, middle class, and above it. And so, you know, if you're in the upper 1 and something %, which has far too much voice and power in what is happening today, than you are in the rest of the nation, you have a problem. So globalization became the piñata for all these disruptions that people were feeling. And we tried to have trade deals. When we had a trade deal, we said, you've got to put environment within the 4 corners of the deal. You've got to put labor standards within the 4 corners of the deal. And you look at something like the minimum wage in America. I've been advising, I'm chairman of the advisory board for the Bank of America, which is an improbable kind of thing for some of the things people think about. But they put now $425 billion into alternative renewable energy. And guess what? They've raised their minimum wage to $20 an hour. You tell me how many people in America have done that. So that's beginning to realize, if you look at Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock's letter recently, which got a lot of coverage, that we have to become a capitalism that is again focused not just on shareholder value, but on stakeholder. And now we're seeing a whole new dialogue in our country about how to create greater corporate responsibility. I think it's the healthiest thing that could happen, frankly. So I'm an optimist that we will rebalance. But right now, people don't have a sense of that balance. And our education system is going to have to tune up. I mean, I'm told by a lot of colleges and universities, I will not speak for ONU, but I'm told in various parts of the country where I visit and listen, people have told me that there are more people coming in to freshman year in college who automatically go to remedial math and remedial writing because they can't write and they can't compute. And so there's a whole lot of makeup that we have to do in order to get going. Part of it ought to be this global transition.
All right.
Globalization is the future of this country. We are global citizens as well as sovereign citizens of the United States of America. And we've got to understand that and appreciate it, because nothing happens in the world, start with climate, pandemic, health, that does not affect this country in some way.
This is true. All right.
And by the way, folks, whatever business you're in, 95% of all the world's customers live in other countries. So if you got a business, and nowadays with the internet, there are a whole bunch of people who are tiny little enterprises, 2 people, 1 person working, 3 people in the kitchen table producing something who can sell things and are selling things globally. So we're just in a very different world, but we've got to keep track of the people who get left behind by the transition. That is what we haven't been doing.
Well, speaking of the need for the transition, we're going to transition now to the topic of climate change, which is the main point of your discussion tonight. You just spoke about the climate crisis, yet the United States is quite literally the spoiler for any global climate regime because we won't reliably commit to greenhouse gas reductions. And you recently told Rob Meyer of The Atlantic that other countries hide behind the U.S. inaction. UNO Senior Kerry Anderson asks, given the disastrous effects of climate change, do you regret voting for the Byrd-Hagel resolution, especially given the challenges it has created for the United States to join international climate change treaties? And you better be careful with your answer because she's sitting behind you.
But part of the point is be careful which answer is the Byrd-Hagel.
If you ever put your guest, you think back to the hospital. Wow, that's dangerous. No, let me be very, I mean, this is something a lot of people don't understand the context, and there's no reason they would. I don't say that pejoratively in terms of the workings of the Senate. I was the manager on the floor of that amendment, you may recall. And Robert Byrd, who was the leader at that point in time, very, very powerful senator, Appropriations Committee chairman, came to the floor and had this amendment because he appropriately, and Chuck felt, wait a minute, we're going to sign on to a mandatory reduction, and China, which is #2 in emissions in the world, is not required to do anything. This was
They were #2 at the time, though.
No, but they're #1 now.
They were #1 now, and right around 2000.
Now, in the world's emissions, but that was obvious to everybody.
Yeah.
We all knew China was going like this. And China, today, China is 30% of the world's emissions. We are 15. And then third, Europe as a group is third after us. And then you have Japan and Russia at about 7%, 6% each, and it goes down. 130 countries are less than 1%. So how can those countries not look at us and say, whoa, wait a minute, you're telling us we got to do X, Y, and Z, and you guys aren't serious about it? So that amendment was calculated to be a check on the flaw in the Kyoto Agreement, and it was a flaw. We would have loved to have gotten other countries in. We simply couldn't get anything in Kyoto. And it was a choice between getting something and maybe assuming responsibility, and then we'll bring others on board, or not. But the politics of the United States Senate just shut it down. And I made the decision of all of my caucus. I said, everyone should vote for this because we don't want to be deemed to make this the vote that kills the concept of an international negotiation. We want this to be a reflection of the attitude that just going it alone is not going to work. And that was what the meaning of that vote was. It's one of those very difficult, subtle kinds of things that there's no reason anybody else would know how to interpret it. It just looks like, wow, you guys all voted against it. No, we were desperately, even Al Gore, everybody, we all voted against it so we could live to fight another day.
That amendment, the Byrd-Hagel amendment, was never intended to stop our efforts on climate change. Never. And John has described it in a good way.
Intended to get everybody in.
It was intended to get everybody in, to show the unity, and it made sense. And if you read that amendment, you'll understand. My role in that, why my name got associated with it, and John will remember this, I was the chairman of the subcommittee of the Foreign Relations Committee that had jurisdiction. And so my caucus, and the Republicans were in control of the Senate at the time, my caucus, then they all agreed that I should lead that effort and on the side. I didn't have the standing experience, the background that John did, because he'd been at this for years. I just got into the Senate. I hadn't been in the Senate for a year. And so I agreed to lead on our side. Byrd was the commanding presence, but he turned to John and asked John to manage the amendment on the floor. John Kerry and I led the delegation to Kyoto, and Gore showed up, and I think we were at all the conferences after that. The Netherlands, Deb Fidelki is here in the audience. She went to all of the conferences with me as one of my top environmental people, and then went to work with President Bush after President Bush was elected. So John's description of that is exactly right.
All right. Very good. Thank you. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to go moderator's choice on this one. So hearing what you've told me about the efforts to address this enormous problem with climate change, the time horizon is getting shorter, the danger is getting more dire, and we seem to be a little glassy-eyed when it comes to actual solutions. Every country seems to be in this to maximize their own benefit. All right, that's understandable in a sovereign world, but there's no such thing as an ecologically sovereign country. Senator, you said it yourself, there's no such thing as over there. So I'm going to ask you a bit of an abstract academic type question. How do we rethink international relations to make ecological sovereignty the baseline instead of political sovereignty? How do we bring the environment to be the basis of international relations rather than political and economic comparative gain?
With all due respect, I believe that Mother Nature, Mother Earth, is screaming at us about it, and it's going to happen because the feedback loops are sending us messages every single day, which everybody is now beginning to really recognize. Coral reefs, spawning grounds for fish, et cetera, are bleaching out. The acidity of the ocean is rising. People think of the ocean as this vast place that nothing can affect. Wrong. Out of 18 major fisheries in the world, 8 of them are overfished and the rest are at peak. And unfortunately, 415 million Chinese who are now middle class have discovered sushi. So blue tuna will probably go extinct the rate that these fishery fleets are doing things. Too much money is chasing too few fish. That's just the live component of what's in the ocean. You've got the acidity is changing the biology of life in the earth. We are changing the chemistry of the ocean faster and more than what has changed in 50 million years. And you're seeing crustaceans, for instance, lobsters, crabs, anything with a hard shell, now are smaller and/or the shells are affected in certain places. If you were to put clams in different levels of acidity water, acid water, you will see that the big acid water, the smallest clams, the less acidity, the bigger the clams. So life is being affected. We are an ecosystem. We don't talk about it that way. We don't think about it that way. But everything relates to everything else. We have something like 100 million sharks killed every year. We're destroying the predator relationship in the ocean because we're not thoughtful about what we're doing. And that's just on Earth. That's just in the ocean. You know, on Earth, the pollution that is now spreading, non-source point pollution. Look, I'm the biggest fan in the world of Lewis and Clark and the Missouri River. You guys live on it. And I've read, I love that journey and that story, and I've traveled much of it. But the Missouri River picks up what comes off the tiled agriculture, and you have huge nitrate overload that flows out together with gasoline from gasoline stations when the rain comes, and it washes it in the sewers and out into the rivers and out into the Mississippi and down to the Delta, and you go down there and you have a 500-mile dead zone. where nothing lives. We now have 500 dead zones around the world that are like that. So there is cause and effect to the choices we make about how we live and what we do. And so Mother Earth is telling us this now. Houston, 2 years ago. Folks, how many of you are aware that you all spent collectively with your fellow citizens $265 billion 2 years ago to clean up after 3 storms? 265 billion just to clean up after the storms. Harvey dropped more water in 5 days in Houston than goes over Niagara Falls in an entire year. Irma had the first measured sustained winds of 185 miles an hour for 24 hours until Dorian came along and blew the record away a couple of years later. We have once every 100 years, 500 year, 1,000-year events now taking place with regularity. And scientists are telling us, we don't know exactly where the tipping point is that you can't come back from it. We're told, for instance, if you got up to 27 to 30% die-off in the Amazon, you could lose the rainforest itself because you've changed the cycle of moisture.
But these problems don't appear to be affecting our international politics. We still see
Actually,
it
they
on a country by
are.
country basis.
No. They are affecting our international politics.
How so?
Well, Britain has now elected, the EU now has a new commission, new leadership has come in. They are going to implement a Green Deal, a real Green Deal that can be passed, that is effective. They are rapidly, I'm told they're probably going to outlaw diesel engine. They're moving to massive mandatory reductions. They're going to take the lead because they get what's happening. And this is going to spur an entire new generation of growth. I'll give you an idea, guys. I'm right now in the process of doing due diligence on an investment in Arizona on a company that has already got prototypes, and it's going to produce hydrogen trucks. Hydrogen trucks, which now, and they've seen it, proven, can drive anywhere from 400 to 750 miles on a tank, maybe more as we get better technology. They are fuel cell. They drive electric motors, and these semis are 2,000 horsepower. They'll go up any hill we need to go up. And already major companies, I'm not at liberty to tell you who they are, have ordered literally thousands of these trucks have now back ordered. And this company is producing a huge plant down there. New jobs, folks. The estimates from really thoughtful economists are that this is going to be a multi-trillion-dollar market as we do what we need to do to respond. So I believe things are happening. This is what makes me an optimist. I think we're on the brink of moving, and if you all will vote this, if you'll vote for this and demand this of public people, we have the technology to make these things happen. We don't even have a national grid in the United States of America. Did you know that? You can't take energy produced by windmills in Iowa and send it to certain parts of the country, or here in Oklahoma, or in Nebraska. Can't do that. We should be able to. We're living in the age of artificial intelligence, the age of quantum computing. We should be able to put together a virtuous grid where we can send energy to the places that don't happen to have the wind or the sun that day. So you can bridge the divide. There are all kinds of things available to us. I was in Iceland recently. Iceland is 100% renewable. Tiny country. It happens to be blessed with remarkable geothermal. So they have geothermal and hydro. 100% of their energy comes from both. But they've now discovered a way to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, put it into the basalt underground, mix it with liquid, and it turns into stone. So that's how we get rid of it. I mean, the possibilities, folks, of American ingenuity to push this curve is unlimited, I believe. And I think if we will start heeding the messages from Mother Earth and come together as a world around this, there's a very exciting future for us. But economists are telling me Right now, between now and 2030, we have about a 2.8 to 4.8 trillion dollar deficit. We don't have the money. That's the deficit of what we ought to be spending to make this transition. So again, how does a democracy get to respond fast enough to these kinds of challenges? We got to have these kinds of meetings. I've started an organization called World War Zero, and it's bipartisan. Chuck is part of it. Bill Cohen, the former Secretary of Defense, Senator from Maine, Republican, is part of it. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Republican governor of California, is part of it. Former governor of New Jersey, Christie Todd Whitman, Republican, is part of it. We've got President Carter, President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Madeleine Albright, myself, but we have a lot of other types of people. We have the former president of MIT, Susan Humphrey. We have the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. We have former prime ministers of Britain. They're all coming together to say, we have to move faster. We have to do this. We have to make it a voting issue. And that's the goal of World War Zero. You can go to worldwarzero.com, sign up, be involved in your community. We lay out choices that individuals can make in their lives, daily things you can do, choices you can make in your local community, choices you can make. And it doesn't mean diminishing your lifestyle. That's a myth. The people who are denying it want you to think that you can't watch TV or you're not going to have power. Or no, folks, not true. You can have a better life. What we're talking about reducing used to be called pollution. Pollution. That's what motivated 1970. And right now, what we're doing is spewing pollution into the atmosphere. Guess what? Coal-fired power plants affect your lungs. They affect the quality of the particulates in the air. The biggest single cause of children being hospitalized in America every summer is environmentally induced asthma. We spend $55 billion on that as a nation. We will have less cancer, emphysema victims, people who have emphysema or heart disease or bad lungs. They will be better off with less particulates in the air. So there you get better. You get better health. You get better environmental quality. And you also have better jobs, more jobs, and jobs in the future. So we've got to paint a real picture for America, and that's what World War Zero is going to try to do. We want to have about 10 million conversations with Americans digitally, through micro-targeting, through Facebook, Instagram, different ways. We're obviously trying to raise grassroots funding and trying to do all of this. But we believe the future is exciting. And guess what? On I think it's March 15th or somewhere in there, Arnold Schwarzenegger, former governor of Ohio, Republican, John Kasich, and I are going to go to Ohio and do a town hall meeting to talk about these very things and lay out to people with great specificity what we can do to make life better and not have to give up things to have a better future.
World War Zero.
But can I give you one example? I rode on a train in China. It's a high-speed rail. We went 300 miles an hour from Beijing to Tianjin on the coast. And an attendant came up and put a glass of water on my table. Didn't move. 300 miles an hour. And they've got 49 different routes. You can take a train and send goods all the way from China to Europe now. They have 49 different routes they're building. We have the Acela, for those of you on the East Coast. I don't know how many of you have ridden it. It can go 155 miles an hour, 155. But it only goes over 150 miles an hour for 18 miles of the trip from Washington to New York. Why? Because if it goes fast under the Baltimore Tunnel will cave in. Slight problem. Or if it goes fast over those rickety bridges of the Chesapeake, it will wind up in the Chesapeake. So I don't think there's any one of you here who could name a national building project that you're proud of, or we Americans are really invested in and excited about now. And the reason you can't name it is there isn't one. We're not building anything anymore. The federal government pulled out of high-speed rail in California. And so this makes me mad. I don't know about you, but we invented the internet. We went to the moon. We're the people who invented most of the appliances and things people use in the world today. And we just sort of suddenly stopped. We're the richest country on the planet. And we're not willing to basically invest in a lot of things we need to do for the future. So I think hopefully you leave here invigorated and feeling that you got to communicate to your fellow citizens. We got to have real conversations about how you make a nation not just great again, but how you make it fair and how you invest in the future.
So we could have an ecological republic if we can keep it.
A what?
We could have an ecological republic if we could keep it.
There you go.
All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.